This lesson will cover the requirement to serve at least one whole grain-rich food item per day. The information is found in Chapter 2 of the CACFP Administrative Manual. One serving of the grain items offered per day must be whole grain-rich. While one serving is required, a best practice is to serve 2 or more whole grain-rich food items per day. If the only meal provided is a snack and no grain items are served, the requirement does not apply. This whole grain-rich requirement does not pertain to infants. Whole grain-rich means a food includes at least 50% whole grains and the remaining grains in the item are enriched. 4 options are available to identify whole grain-rich items: the product label, an FDA statement on the package, the ingredients label, or a product formulation statement from the manufacturer. If the product label says the item is 100% whole grain, the product may be considered whole grain rich. The whole grain stamp appearing on some products cannot be used to identify whole grain rich foods unless it specifically states the item is 100% whole grain. Product packages may also include a Food and Drug Administration or FDA-approved whole grain health claim stating either that diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and some cancers, or that diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in saturated fat and cholesterol may help reduce the risk of heart disease. A product must include at least half whole grain to qualify for this statement. Either of these declarations is sufficient to identify the product as whole grain rich. The following words on a product label do not signify whole grain rich: made with whole grain, contains whole grain, stone ground, multigrain, or 7-grain, or organic. Grain-based desserts are not creditable and cannot count toward whole grain rich requirements. However, they may be served as extra food items. Examples of grain-based desserts include cookies, cakes and brownies, breakfast bars, cereal bars and granola bars, donuts and sweet rolls, pie crust used to make sweet pies, and toaster pastries. To use the ingredient label to identify whole grain rich items, it must list a whole grain as either the first ingredient or the first ingredient after water, and the remaining grain ingredients must be enriched. Whole grains include any whole grain such as whole wheat, whole corn, whole barley, and whole rye. Look for the word whole followed by the name of a grain. These ingredients are also whole grains even though the word whole is not used. Brown and wild rice, all types of oatmeal and rolled oats, bulgur, quinoa, millet, triticale, teff, amaranth, buckwheat, sorghum, grain berries or groats, and graham flour. The following ingredients are not whole grains: wheat flour, cornmeal, degermed cornmeal, bromated flour, organic wheat flour, farina, durum flour, bran, pearled barley, germ, long grain white rice, and unbleached flour. Do not use the color of a product to identify if it is whole grain rich. Food coloring may be added to make a food appear to contain whole grain when it contains little or none. If a whole grain is not listed first, but multiple whole grains are included on the ingredient label, a manufacturer's statement is needed to document that the combined weight of all whole grains in the item is at least 50% of the total weight of all the grains in the product. The remaining grains must be enriched. Homemade whole grain rich items must be documented with a recipe showing the combined weight of all whole grains is at least 50% of the total weight of all grains in the recipe. The remaining grains in the item must be enriched. Let's look at a few examples and determine if the items meet the criteria to be counted as whole grain rich foods. Whole wheat flour is the first and only grain ingredient in this whole wheat bagel. This item is 100% whole grain and is therefore considered whole grain rich. Whole wheat flour is the first ingredient in this blueberry muffin, so the first criterion has been met. The only other grain ingredient is enriched flour, so the second criterion has also been met. The product is considered whole grain rich. In this example, the English muffin lists whole wheat flour as the first ingredient after water, meeting the first criterion. The only other grain ingredient is enriched flour, meeting the second criterion. Therefore, the item is whole grain rich. The next example is oat bread. It lists unbleached enriched flour as the first grain ingredient and also includes whole wheat flour and whole oats. The other grain ingredient is enriched unbleached flour, so the second criterion is met. However, a product formulation statement is required to determine if the combined weight of the whole wheat flour and rolled oats is more than the weight of the enriched flour. The same criteria apply to mixed dishes such as pizza, burritos, and pasta, except the first grain ingredient must be a whole grain, or multiple whole grains are the primary grain ingredient by weight. The remaining grains must be enriched. A CN label, product formulation statement, or recipe must be on file to document the serving size and crediting information. For example, whole wheat flour is the first grain ingredient in this cheese ravioli product, so the first criterion has been met. The only other grain ingredient is enriched flour, so the second criterion has also been met, and the product can be considered whole grain rich. However, to credit the product, a product formulation statement is still needed to define the serving size and the product's contribution toward the meat alternate, and grain requirements. This is an example of a product formulation statement for Old El Paso Fold and Go Chipotle Chicken from General Mills. The statement says the product meets the whole grain rich criteria and provides 2 grain servings per 4.37 ounce serving. The statement is signed and meets requirements to identify the serving size, component contribution, and whole grain rich criteria. Product formulation statements will be covered in more detail in a separate lesson. Other food items can count as creditable grain ingredients, including enriched and fortified grains, bran, and germ. These items don't count toward the whole grain rich requirement alone, but can be included in whole grain rich items. Enriched means vitamins and minerals have been added to replace some of the nutrients lost during processing. Thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, folic acid, and iron must be included for a food to be labeled enriched. If the ingredient statement uses the word enriched and/or includes these nutrients, the item is enriched. This ingredient label shows the first ingredient is enriched, followed in parentheses by the added nutrients. Fortified means essential nutrients have been added either in quantities greater than those normally present in the food or which are not normally present in the food at all. Cereal is a food that is commonly fortified. Some products will state they are fortified on the front of the package. If not, use the ingredient list and nutrition fact label to determine if the product is fortified. Shown is an example of an ingredient list for a fortified cereal showing the addition of nutrients not normally present in cereal. This is the nutrition facts label from the same product listing the percent daily value of the added nutrients. Bran and germ are nutrient-rich parts of a whole grain kernel. They are not whole grains, but can be ingredients in whole grain-rich foods. Label whole grain-rich foods on menus with the letters WG next to the food item and keep the appropriate labels on file to document requirements were met. This concludes the lesson on serving whole grain-rich foods. If you have questions, please contact your CACFP consultant or the state agency. Contact information can be found in the front of the manual.